Today, Denny Paul and I would like to welcome you to our transition training. The purpose of the training is to update you on the new record review document that has been revised recently. We thought it would be best that if we start fresh with the training since we did complete a training last year. At the end of this session, you will take a quiz and then you will give it to your director of special ed at the end, so they will know that you have taken the quiz and you have gone through the session. The next thing I want to talk about is the QR code. You need to turn on your camera on your phone and then you hover it over the QR code and then it will pop up Google Docs, and then that's when you click that and you put in the information. You need to make sure that you put your email correctly in there. Sometimes we've had that already happen to us. The PD form will come to your email. So if you don't get a PD form, you may not have put your email in correctly. So make sure that you put your correct email address in there.
So what we're seeing here is a norm slide that we use with all of our trainings that just really talks a lot about the proper procedures for being in a Zoom session. And we know that all of you all are getting well versed in that now. And so we're not going to spend a lot of time with this, but we just want to, remind you little things, like mute yourself, find a quiet place to work, gather your materials ahead of time, show positive body language, stay engaged, use the chat function, raise your hand, use the chat features that we have, embedded in Zoom, and we'll get along just fine. We typically operate on about a 50-10 type of timing, and what I mean by that is we typically go 50 minutes and take a break for 10. But in this case, we're going to go right on through, and we're going to work for about an hour and a half, and we'll have 2 sessions here. And this first session is going to talk about the first part of what we're going to need to know about transition.
Transition is one of the indicators that KDE must report to OSEP. It is important that districts provide the necessary training so that students exit their high school with a plan for a career or to continue their education, whether it be going to college or a technical school.
Change slide.
Before we start, we want you to know the transition indicator has changed from indicator 49 to indicator 51. There are several sections for indicator 51. These sections provide information to help the students with disability transition from high school to work or continue education.
Change slide.
This training is an overview of how to become proficient in the use of the Kentucky Compliance Record Review document to access district compliant as required under Indicator 13, and the appropriate methods for documenting Indicator 13 compliance. There is a link to the IEP guidance document in the on the KDE webpage.
When we think about transition, we realize that this is rooted in regulation. We understand that the federal government insists that we do this, and that at the state level, our state, like all other states in the union, have to report on these indicators. This Indicator 13 transition, post-secondary transition that we talk about so much, has a legislative base. It also has a KAR base, which is the Kentucky Administrative Regulations, that talks about what's required in IEP once a student turns 14 or turns 16. So in that regard, we realize that this is something that's handed down to us from the regulations at the federal level, but also it's state law as well. So we really have to be paying attention to this, and we really have to do a good job, not only to be compliant, but also because it's the right thing to do for students. When you see this regulation, you realize that there are things in there that just have to be in there. We realize that you're going to have a well-developed post-secondary goal, and then you're going to have services to support that. You're going to have a multi-year course of study to support the matriculation between grades, and then you're also going to have documentation for all of this in your conference summaries and you're going to have to include the student. It's very important that we include the student. So that's all part of the regulation, and that's something that we want to keep in mind as we move through these slides.
This slide presents an overview of the compliance review document. Promotion of a consistent standard of documentation is the goal of the document itself. The numbers again have been updated from number 49 to 51. And I hope we don't say 49 during this session, but it could accidentally slip out because we're so used to saying 49.
Been like that a long time.
That's right. So we've been in this business quite a long time, so it may slip out. But in the case, it is number 51, I'm sorry.
You know, today's presentation will focus on how to document the 9 post-secondary transition requirements. I kind of touched on briefly there a little bit to meet compliance for Indicator 13. This is not to take away from other transition-related requirements in IDEA or the KARs. We focus on these 9 requirements because they're components of Indicator 13 of the State Performance Plan and the annual performance report that KDE has to report to OSEP each year. So each year the directors have to make a report. Directors of special ed have to make a report to the state and upload it in the DOS secure upload. And they have to report on at least 10 students, and they have to have 100% compliance on these indicators. So these components, we have to know them, we have to be able to document them, and we have to be able to implement them, more importantly for the students with disabilities. Since Kentucky has been reporting on our monitoring data for Indicator 13, Kentucky has yet to ever be able to report 100% compliance rate to OSEP. So we continue to see this as a focus from KDE, and from time to time your district can be cited if they've gone through a desk review or if they've gone through a consolidated monitoring visit. And so OSEP mandates that any non-compliance be corrected within 1 year. And so we know that as we move through this, that this is a very serious business. It's very serious in compliance, but it's also serious for these students who really need our help in building these robust plans and making sure that we're implementing these plans so that they can successfully transition into post-secondary life.
Look for in the IEP must be specific to that student and aligned, and what we're thinking about aligned here is using the assessments that are updated in the ILP. KDE has a template in IC that you complete for the post-secondary goal. The student must have a training or education component and an employment component. And then for students that require independent living skills, they will have a separate goal that needs to be written into the transition.
Here are examples of how compliant post-secondary goals should be written. They should include training or education and employment, and then when appropriate, independent living skills. Now, I would like for you to think about that a little bit as we move through this training. We're going to talk about independent living and the need for that. When a student has, an adaptive score that is somewhat deficient, we need to be thinking about why and how we might attack that. And this is one way where we need to show support for that. So an independent living skills goal would be appropriate for students that have these issues. And so we want to think about that, not just because the training and education and employment are required, it alleviates us of thinking about that. But as we document this, we should be thinking about documenting a conference summary. If we're not going to include an independent living skills goal, why we're not doing that for each student with disabilities. And then if we are going to include it, we would also want to know the why. So we really need to think about that. Each goal should be measurable to include what the student is actually going to do and how it's going to be done. What makes the goal measurable is, making sure that we can see it, hear it, count it, time it. And also we need to keep in mind that it needs to always be after high school. So we need to be able to see those things as we move forward. We're going to change slides.
Here is the template that is in Infinite Campus. In IC, you have 3 options for stating the goal is going to happen after the students graduate from high school. In this example, we have after high school. Then we place the student's name and write either the education or training and what type of employment the student will be doing.
So after graduation, it says Sally Sue's goal is to receive on-the-job training at her local church to be able to volunteer as a children's church teaching assistant. Now, Sally Sue can play music during the children's church by shaking a maraca or a tambourine, and she would be fulfilling this goal. Upon completion of high school, another goal might be that Jerry's goal is to receive on-the-job training to the local library so that she can be an assistant storyteller. And certainly then Jerry could be an assistant storyteller by holding the book and turning the page while the teacher reads the story. So there's many ways, when we look at examples of post-secondary goals for students with their most significant cognitive disabilities, we see that, these things can be attained, they can be done, and we just need to think long and hard and outside the box when it comes to developing goals that students can actually attain. And it's certainly something that is very beneficial for the student and something that we want to be thinking about. So here are some examples of independent living skills. These are compliant and they're post-secondary independent living goals that would include, when writing a post-secondary goal, the independent living goal must still include separate goal for training and education. Just because you have an independent living goal does not alleviate you of having to do the other pieces. So when you have an independent living, then you're going to have two separate goals written in your documentation. And the first goal, of course, is going to work toward education and employment and training, and then your post-secondary living goal then would be measurable, describe what the skill the student's actually going to do independently and how they're going to do it and where they're going to do it. So here are some examples of non-compliant post-secondary goals. We draw on Anita Archer's teaching philosophy a lot, and so anytime we think about giving you some examples of compliant goals, we want to do non-compliance because we know that Anita Archer teaches us to do examples, non-examples, and it really helps to crystallize that for us in our thinking and in our learning. Here are some examples of how post-secondary goals should not be written. What makes these post-secondary goals non-compliant? It does not include specific training or education, or it does not include specific employment. So let's look at goal number 1. Job training program, highlighted in purple, explains the specific training or education or how the student plans to get their required training or education. This is correct. However, retail setting highlighted in purple does not specifically state what employment the student plans to pursue. So this goal is non-compliant. And we can say that Brenda and I review a lot of files across the region, and we see this a lot. We see this where we put extra words in that are not needed. We really need just to stick to our guns here when we develop these training, education, and employment goals. Just make sure we get that specific piece in there, what training they're going to get, what education they're going to get, where they're going to be enrolled specifically, and then what specific job are they going to be doing. So we don't want to say work in the retail setting. We want to say they're going to be a cashier or they're going to be an assistant manager. We need to know the job and make it more specific to the student so that it is measurable.
So here is another example of Infinite Campus. And as you can see, previously I told you there were 3 areas that we could click to show that it's going to happen after the student graduates. So here we have either after high school, after graduation, or upon completion of high school. We have to click one of those areas just to show that it is going to happen after high school. So under the post-secondary goal, you have to select the drop-down box and you click whichever one that you want. It doesn't matter which one, whatever one that you want. Below the student's goal is to, you have to enter specific education or of how or where the student plans to get their required training or education. And then you're also going to have to put in here where it says to be able to, you have to add a specific employment behavior of what the student plans to be employed as. So if they're going to be a welder, we need to make sure that we put in there a welder. Okay, so here we have another example of Infinite Campus, and it's dropping us down to the box, the 3 choices that you have to pick from the drop-down box. And then again, under the post-secondary goal, you select that regarding to whatever the student will be doing after high school. And then below the student's goal, you have to type the specific independent skill. So you're looking here on this slide as at the independent skills instead of just the education, training, and employment. So we're looking at the independent living goal here. So make sure that it's the same, except you are now going back to the independent living skills instead of the education, training, employment goal. Okay, to see available transition service options, you have to click on the goal in Infinite Campus. And it will have a little saying over there, transition services. And you have to click onto that, and then you add the transition services that match what you're doing with that specific child. And remember, we have to have one is a must, and that is the course of study leading to the diploma. Or if it's a child that's going to be exiting the program, you have to state that as well. So we have to make sure that we do put transition services in there. We've found, Denny Paul and I have done regular reviews, and we have found that sometimes they're blank, and we really think that it was because in the past you didn't have to click on the post-secondary goal to get those. You could just type them in, but now you have, it's a different process. So we just need to make sure that we get those transition service goals in there.
And you know, Brenda, you're exactly right. Lots of times when we look at these files, we will find these things left out. And it's so important that we understand that we have to have that multi-year course of study filled out. We've got to have the ILP, and we've got to make sure that we're updating those goals, you know, as we move through. And so those are real strong pieces of compliance documentation. After you've completed the required components in Infinite Campus, the student's post-secondary goals should look like this example when printed out on the student's IEP. And you know, with post-secondary goals, we realize that you're always going to have a piece that's going to say it's going to occur after high school or after graduation. There's, you know, you have that on the drop-down box. Brenda's already talked about that. Then you're going to have a piece in the training and education section of this goal when you're developing it, and it's going to be specific to the student, where they're going to be enrolled, what training program they're going to be in, and we really like to see what are they going to attain when they go to this particular institution. And so then in the last part, the job piece, we've kind of already talked about this a little bit just a few minutes ago, but we really want to see a specific job title, a specific job. And so it's very important that we have those pieces in place, or the goal will be insufficient.
Okay, transition services are defined as a coordinated set of activities that are updated annually. The transition planning process is student-centered, student-driven, and embedded throughout the entire IEP process. In Kentucky, the process of planning post-secondary transition services begins when the student is in the 8th grade or age 14, whichever comes first. The student is invited to each ARC meeting where the transition services are to be discussed. And then we're going to discuss the coordinated transition activities that will help the students be successful for their post-secondary goal. Again, for the student that's in the 8th grade or 14, you don't develop the post-secondary goal at that time. But this is leading to that post-secondary goal. So once the student does get to be 16, and we always say 15 because sometimes the student turns 16 during that IEP. So we go ahead and write the post-secondary goal at that time, so we don't have another meeting that the parent has to attend in the same year. Okay, so on 49B, and we've touched on this a little bit ago, this is talking about your transition services. And again, I want to keep on saying this because sometimes those transition services are left out that's underneath your post-secondary goal. You have to make sure that when you're in Infinite Campus, you click onto that goal, and then it will take you to a list depending on the area that you chose and your present levels that you can use to put that in there. Or if you already have ideas, the ARC already has ideas, they can go ahead and type them in without going into the drop-down box.
And these slides just give you a kind of a laundry list of the types of services that might be included. And we would encourage you to build robust plans, work with all the opportunities that are offered for your students, and try to get them in the communities, working a little bit, job shadowing as things continue to improve with the current situation we're in with COVID. We want to think about how can we do this with our students and still make it worthwhile and make it so that it is a plan that is real and has some teeth in it, and it really assists the student in learning how to deal with post-secondary life and how to get the training, the education that they need to be successful. And this is a real focus of the IEP at the high school level, and it is the focus of the IEP at the high school level. And so lots of times we think about services, and we want to try to connect those services to what's going on at school. We identify the barriers, and then we start trying to work on some of the barriers that the student might have due to the disabling condition, and we keep thinking about it, we keep looking at it, we keep updating it every year, and then we're going to get it so that the student is going to really get some benefit from it.
After you have completed the required components in Infinite Campus, the student's post-secondary goals should look like this example when printed out on the student's IEP.
We also talked a little bit earlier about the legislative base. We talked about the services that are rooted in the law, and so we realize that a coordinated set of activities is what we're talking about here, because that's what the OSEP law says, and we have a citation here, and you have also a hot link on your screen there that we can send this to you, and you can go straight into the Federal Registry and look at what the law says about this. But we understand that transition services are meant to assist the student in reaching their post-secondary goal. For some students, this may mean transition services are needed early in their education career. Transition services should not be the same for every student, as present levels shouldn't be the same for every student. We want to inform our present levels for transition with updated assessments, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later. But transition services are not dependent on the student's current grade level. We just need to think about the robust plan that we're trying to create, and we need to get services that match the student's needs, and that's so important. On 51C, this is a snapshot of the item 51C in Compliance Record Review in the Transition Services section. You would look in the Admission and Release Committee meeting to make sure that you're documenting agency involvement. If you have an outside agency that is going to be needed to be invited to the ARC meeting, you have to document the need for that, or you also would have to document that you've discussed it and you don't need it, it's not appropriate at this time. So when you look at your ARC notice, you would document either that you're going to invite voc rehab, or you're going to invite another outside agency like a community college representative or whatever. And then also there's a place to mark there that it's not appropriate at this time to invite someone. So those things need to be discussed in the ARC meeting. They need to be documented, and they need to be marked clearly. And we can't leave that part out. We just have to make sure that when we're doing the inviting, we're inviting the student, we're including the post-secondary goal as a purpose for every student that's 13 and above, and that we're also making sure that if we do have outside agency involvement, that we have invited them or we've not invited them, depending on what's appropriate, and make sure that we've captured that in our documentation. So as you see here, we have a screenshot from one of the documents that we use, which is the Notice of ARC, and we realize that you may not leave this section blank if the student is 16 or older. And what I'm talking about is that little piece down there at the bottom where the arrows are pointing that says it's not appropriate at this time, or we're going to invite voc rehab, or we're going to invite another agency. So we need to address that. We need to discuss that in the conference summary. We need to capture that in our minutes. And we need to, if we're not inviting someone, outside agency that's going to pay for some of these services that the student's going to need, then we need to explain why it's not appropriate. and it's very important that we capture that documentation, that it's not appropriate at this time. This is a snapshot of 51D for the compliance record review in the transition services section. This is where you're going to need, if you invite an outside agency, you cannot violate the FERPA law by allowing this outside agency to know that there's a student that has disability without the parent giving you permission to do so. So to kind of recap that, anytime you're inviting an outside agency to an ARC meeting, you must get a consent form filled out and a signature from the parent. You have to update that with the student when they turn 18 and become emancipated. And we have to do that each and every time. And there's another slide that we're going to talk about here in just a second that tells us why we have to do that. But each and every time you invite an outside agency, you have to get a new consent form signed. And so it's so very vital. Now, we talk a lot about, and I think I'm going to go back to the slide before. So if you notice up there at the very top left-hand corner, there's a date where this notice will be generated in your computer. And you'll have that date, and then you're supposed to have your meeting 7 days into the future, and that date's going to appear on down the page there. So what we say is when we get the consent form signed, we want that signed and dated 1 day before that date up there, so that there's no chance that anybody could ever say that we violated FERPA and that we have not allowed registry information to be released to an outside agency without having consent to do so. So it's very, very important that we do that and do it in a manner that is compliant and in keeping with what we're supposed to do timeline-wise. So this letter from OSEP, the letter to Gray that was dated March 17, 2008, is the letter that gives the opinion that OSEP has that says we have to have a consent each time. So we can't get a blanket consent that's going to last from, say, age 14 all the way through to age 21 or age 13 all the way through. If we're going to invite an outside agency to a meeting, we have to have a new informed consent signed. And so what that means is that every time we get a new consent, and it's informed consent. So we have to inform the parent of what we're getting the permission to do. And we also really need to make sure that we understand that when we inform, we also can't have multiple outside agencies on one form. If you're inviting 2 outside agencies, you have to have a separate form for each. So it's very important. And letter to Gray is just being provided to us as a backdrop for the opinion from OSEP, and OSEP kind of, their opinions matter. And so we have to pay attention to this, and we have to comply with this as it's been handed down. So every time you have an outside agency consent, and every time you have a outside agency invited to your ARC meeting, you must get permission from the parent and inform them, and then also do so with the 18-year-olds.
Okay, so again, prior consent, we're stressing this because sometimes we don't get the consent in time, and we will go ahead and we send out the notice of the ARC meeting, which is illegal. So that's one reason why we're trying to stress that this is very important. It's very important, and we don't want to violate any type of laws. And we also want to make sure that once that student turns 18 and he's emancipated, he or she is emancipated, then we have to get consent from that student. So we want to make sure that we are doing the rights appropriately. That's one reason why we are asked in the IEP, or the conference summary, to talk about the child being emancipated at least 1 year prior to the child being 18. And I personally think we ought to do that about age 16. Just because you may turn 17 in the middle of an IEP, and we have to have at least 1 year notice. The parents have to have at least a 1 year notice. So we just need to make sure that we get these prior consents on time.
Brenda, I might add too here that when we do a record review, and when we have an Indicator 13 desk review, or we have an audit, it is very clear that there are a couple things that we can't fix. And this is one of those things that we cannot fix. So if you get called and you have to send this file, you cannot fix a prior consent. If you mess the prior consent up, it's not something that you can go back and fix. Now, there's lots of things in Indicator 13 that you can fix, and they encourage us to fix through the process. And we meet with you, and we work through it with you, and we're glad to do so. But this is one we can't really mess up. And then the other thing that we can't mess up is making sure that the IEP is updated annually. We have to make sure, number one, that the IEP is current and that it's not fallen into a situation where the timeline has dwindled and we have an IEP that's out in our jargon, for lack of a better way of saying it. And so we also have to update those present levels, and we're going to talk about that later. But it's very, very important to understand that there are a couple things that we can't fix, and we have to pay attention to our timeline, make sure our IEPs, the annual review date is set in stone and we get it before the timeline is up, and then also that we get permission if we're going to invite someone from the outside. We're going to change slides.
Okay, this is a snapshot of an example of a consent for outside agency, and we do have that in Infinite Campus, so you don't have to go searching for it anywhere. You can go right into Infinite Campus and it'll be right there for you. IDEA, it requires that consent be informed, which means that the parent or the emancipated student must be informed as to which agencies are invited to participate in post-secondary transition planning and implementation. The consent document must be clear about what period of time the consent is provided so that the parent or the child, if the child is emancipated, understands the permission he or she is providing. So we must make sure that we do have this documented, that it is signed, and that when the child turns 18, that the child will be signing unless the parent goes to court and gets a court document.
Multi-year course of study. This is one component of the IEP. This is required. Once the student turns 14 or is in the 8th grade, as a transition service, the student has a multi-year course of study. When we train this, we talk a lot about the fact that the special ed teacher plays the role of kind of like an old college counselor, and the discussion must be captured in the conference summary. If it's not captured in the conference summary, it's a non-compliance. So we're supposed to have a robust interchange with the student and with the parents to say that the student is not only has the courses that they need, they're making progress with those courses, and those courses are going to in fact lead to the attainment of the post-secondary goal. So when you put that at age 14, you got to develop it from the year, or from that year forward to the year of expected exit. So you really want to look and see. Sometimes the multi-year course of study will be embedded in the ILP, and we will say, yes, you do have to have an ILP, whether it's a written self-created document or whether it's a programmatic document like Zello or one of those that, the old career cruising, which is no longer being used. But, whether it's computer generated or whether it's a handwritten document, you have to have an ILP. Every student in the state of Kentucky, by law, is supposed to have an ILP. There's a great website on KDE that has a lot of information about the ILP. So, if you have questions about that, we'd be happy to help you with anything around the ILP. But the ILP must inform the course of study. And so there's some assessments and things that we do for students that are age appropriate, and we do them year to year, and we keep them current. And in developing the course of study, we got to have that discussion captured in the conference summary that says, yes, the student's making progress. They're advancing toward graduation, and there's a persistence to graduation tool that exists with the ILP website as well. And so we want to make sure that we're doing our part, kind of filling in the gaps for the student, hey, have you thought about taking this course, or is this course appropriate? And once we establish those courses, they can be tweaked, and they're intended to be tweaked. And so we need to be asking ourselves, are these courses that the student's taking now appropriate for the post-secondary goal? And so that, it's really, really important, and a really important piece.
Okay, so if a student has not developed an ILP, shame on you. The ARC can begin that process with the development of the multi-year course of study. So you have to mark the box yes in the ILP and the IEP that shows that you have the multi-year course of study embedded in the IEP, or you have to mark the box that's showing that you are completing it on a separate sheet of paper. So we have to make sure, no matter what, it has to be there by regulation. This document shows that the ARC considered the student's ILP course of study, the education plan, and used it to develop the present levels transition needs statement. The ARC includes a copy of the student's multi-year course of study in the student's due process file. So one is for the ARC to print out a copy of the student's course of study from the ILP plan, or you can also go ahead and type in the courses that are going to be used for that student to be successful for that post-secondary goal. We know that they are mandatory courses that we have to take, but we got to fill in the electives, and we cannot write the word elective in there. It has to be the specific course that the child is to take for the post-secondary goal.
And when we review files from time to time, Brenda, we realize that students go to vocational facilities sometimes. We want those courses documented. We also realize that the population that we serve with alternate assessment, there's course codes that go along with those courses, and so you have to include those in the course of study. And it's so very important to have the course of study updated, documented, and discussed in your conference summary, because there's a place on the record review document that asks specifically for that, and if you don't have it, it's a non-compliance, and so we'll have to go back and fix it, and that's one that we can fix. So we want to be thinking about it, and we want to get it right the first time, but it is one we can fix. But it's very important that we have that discussion with that student. Is this working for you? Do we have data to support that it's working for you? And so there's a lot more to this, and if you're doing it in the correct way, in a manner that's going to help the student.
Okay, this is a snapshot of where to include the multi-year course of study in the student's IEP. We need to note that we have to include all grade levels when completing the course of study. And the course of study means a multi-year description of coursework from the student's current school year to the anticipated exit year, designed to achieve the student's desired post-secondary goals. So if we need to add additional grades, there is a box that you click on, and you can add those additional grades as well. After you completed the required components in Infinite Campus, the student's completed multi-year course of study section in the IEP should look like this. And when you print it out, it has all the courses that's necessary, and it does not have the word elective in it. They're all specific to the student's need for the post-secondary goal. So we just need to make sure that this is completed, and if you'll notice, this says grade 7. Now, we told you that either when the student was in the 8th grade or age 14. Here is an example of a student that turned 14 in the 7th grade. So remember, it's not only 8th grade, it's when you turn 14 that you must start this process. And this is a snapshot of how the multi-year course of study appears in the ILP.